Yeah, and we're actually going to have Marjorie Taylor Greene on later this afternoon, actually about 1 o'clock. That'll be an interesting, well, certainly some questions we'll ask her. One other thing on this current topic I want to get your view on, because it's if Pompeo was kind of, I mean, it's loosely we can say he was a diplomat. He was one in name only. But General Jack Keane wants to basically pick up the script that Pompeo is reading from and actually wants to go a little further.
I understand the economic pressure, and we talk about it in terms that we're used to dealing with. The amount of revenue they're losing every day, spiraling inflation, currency devaluation, all the things that we look at anybody's economy. And reasonable people would come to the conclusion they can't stand this. They're going to collapse eventually. They're going to eventually bend to our will. I don't think so. And the reason is this is a diabolical tyranny-based terrain that has an ideology to destroy the state of Israel and drive the United States out of the region, and they want to take control. Eventually, President Trump will combine military force and what Secretary Bessent is doing. Yes. And at that point, when we do that, we will bend Iran to our will.
Bend Iran to our will. What do you think of that, Doug? Is that coming?
I think General Keane and probably some of his retired general friends are looking at the possibility of living in villas, sitting on the former territory of Gaza, gazing out at the Mediterranean once Greater Israel is established. I really think these people are living a fantasy. And of course, I know Larry Kudlow is, but he lives in fantasy world. Remember, this is New York City. That's an extension of Israeli Zionist Jewish power. And so that's the seed of it. From his standpoint, there's no alternative but the complete and total annihilation of Iran. And that's what he's plugging for. And I think that's what General Keane wants. I go back again to the question, is it in the interest of the American people to annihilate Iran as a great power? Is that really, really something that's vital to our strategic interest? And now we talked earlier about the Turkish, Saudi, Pakistani alliance that could eventually, and perhaps sooner than later, include Egypt as this fundamentally anti-Israeli alliance designed to protect what is in the region from the Greater Israel Project, and obviously our support. You also have the other alliance in name, not necessarily in name, but in practice, and that's Russia, Iran, and China. And they've all made it very clear that they're not going to stand around and tolerate the annihilation of the Iranian state. So how does this help us as a country to be engaged in this self-defeating enterprise? We gain nothing from it. The only thing we'll end up with is splendid isolation that isn't very splendid, because originally isolationism was only about staying out of other people's wars. We're putting ourselves in a position where that resource sovereignty is going to become absolutely vital, because large numbers of people in the world won't want to do any business with us.
Yeah, that it's hard to see how we're going to avoid that, and there's none of the trend lines are moving in that good direction here. I want to shift over to the Russia-Ukraine war, because you mentioned that a second ago, and you really can't talk about either one of these in isolation, as you have written about on your Substack, about how these are becoming one war here. And let's take a look at some of that stuff. The narrative is still very puzzling. Now, this is from the Associated Press. I think it was published yesterday. Trump told Ukraine it had no cards, and then Kiev took the war to Russia. Went to the details of that. It says Kiev has ramped up a campaign of longer-range strikes inside of Russia and in areas Moscow has seized. Pardon me. Increased production of weapons, targeted Russian air defenses, and hit oil infrastructure and the warehouses of major retailer in a bid to ensure ordinary Russians feel the impact of the conflict. Now, much of that is per se accurate, as they certainly have done those things. They have hit those targets. But then the real question is, does that lead to a war termination or a shift in the direction of the war away from Moscow and towards Kiev, such that at some point that Moscow will go, you know what, that's enough pain. I guess we're going to have to settle on your terms. What do you say?
Well, first, I think we're looking at a 38-40%, or we're looking at a week or two ago, in Russia's capacity to refine oil, petroleum, for various products. This has not really hurt Russia very much, A lot of that damage is rapidly repaired. Refineries are very large, very robust structures. They're not easily destroyed. It takes a lot more effort than what the Ukrainians are able to mobilize, frankly. But having said that, has this had an impact on decision making at the highest levels in Moscow, which I think is the real question. As I talk to people that are coming back from Russia and read what's translated from the Russian media and from their television, I would say Russians are universally very angry, not at President Putin. They're angry at what's being done to them. And increasingly, they blame the West because they know the Ukrainians can't manufacture these weapons. And they're not. They're taking components that come in from the West. They're assembling them. Sometimes they modify them, sometimes they're not. And then they launch them, unmanned and unmanned systems, similar to what the Iranians produced. And also they're launching tactical, not really tactical, but medium-range missiles. And some people are saying they're going to get long-range missiles. If they do, again, that has to come from Great Britain, France, Germany, potentially other countries. Now, that's very dangerous. Fortunately for us, we do not have a madman in the Kremlin. He is much more balanced and rational than we give him credit for being. He's not interested in a war with the West. He wants to do business with the West. He wants to get this thing over with. He wants to be sure that when the war ends, that he and the Europeans can still do business with each other. We're getting very close to radical change politically in a place like Germany and France. Let me stop for a minute and talk about this. There have been meetings outside of Germany in third countries between Russians and Social Democrats. You have to understand the Social Democratic Party is one of the oldest in Germany, dates back to the 1860s and 70s. And they are now contemplating quietly a potential alliance with the alternative for Germany, something which everybody says is impossible and could never happen. Well, they're rethinking this because they have reached a point where in the context of future politics, they're almost irrelevant. And historically, the Social Democrats have always been far more, I don't want to say pro-Soviet at the time, but certainly more understanding towards Moscow at that point. And I think even now, privately more willing to do business with Moscow than the others. That sort of thing could change everything overnight. That could suddenly take Germany out of this entire mess. And the Germans are fed up. There's strong undercurrents for getting out of not just the European Union, but NATO. So I still think that there's a willingness in Moscow to wait for this. Macron is it's astonishing that he's still where he is. I don't know how much longer he'll be there. The point is, we've been waiting for this sort of upheaval that's coming to manifest itself. I think it's on its way. We're going to witness it. That's going to change things. And the question is, can Moscow exercise the restraint and the patience it needs to get there? That's the first. Second, they've already got concentrations of forces that they can move very rapidly to take Odessa and also Kharkov. And I think they would want to do that before they go for Kiev. And going into Kiev is not something they necessarily want to do. It's something they would feel compelled to do because there's no guarantee that any agreement they reach with any government in Kiev right now is going to produce anything they can rely on for the future. And they just don't want to go back to war again in 5 or 10 or 15 years.
And, look, there's some very practical things that are moving in that direction. You mentioned Odessa. This just shows how the air wars continue to happen. This was day before yesterday where there was a massive attack against Odessa. And it's pretty much already shut down as an effective deep sea port there in the Black Sea. So that continues on. And then that's going on with what's happening in the capital city where there's not even the pretense that they have any air defense. And I was talking to somebody that I know that has direct access into even the government level in Ukraine. And they said, listen, if you're seeing that in Kiev, you can imagine everywhere else, especially in the front line, they don't have any defenses on anything. Some areas, they said, got like one Patriot missile per day. that they had, which obviously is meaningless in the terms of air defense. They said against the glide bombs that Russia has, there is no defense. And even Patriots, they don't even hit that kind of target. So they are utterly defenseless in the air, whether it's those drones, now missiles. Where is that going to leave Ukraine? Upon what basis does somebody like the Associated Press say, hey, Kiev took it to Russia and that's going to work, when at least Russia has air defense and they can knock down a majority of things that are sent in there? How does that work?
Well, I think it makes Ukraine ungovernable. It turns it into a rubble pile. It destroys whatever is left of its agriculture, whatever little industry they have. And so Ukraine becomes a dead state. I think it's already a zombie country. It's got a facade for a government. It's mired in more corruption than we can even begin to imagine. I think Europeans, particularly those that live on the border, the Poles know that, which is why the attitude in Poland has changed so radically. That's why the Polish government now says there will be no more aid in terms of Polish advice or support or military assistance. I think the Hungarians understand this, the Slovaks do. These are the countries that border Russia. Now, when you go to Lithuania, which borders Ukraine and White Russia, it's a little different. Ukraine has remained steadfastly, violently anti-Russian. Goes back to the Second World War, as so much does. And we don't understand it. But the point is this. Yes, this war will end. It'll end when suddenly no one sends anything else to Ukraine, because there's no one there to accept it other than a few people with their hands out, anxious to climb on a plane and send whatever funds you gave them to banks in Cyprus or else. So that's when it's going to end, sadly. Now, in the meantime, the Russians hold the cards. They can move decisively whenever they want to move. They have to deal with the fact that we provide the same kind of, not exactly the same, but certainly substantial overhead-based intelligence and surveillance to the Ukrainians, which allows them to launch precision weapons from time to time at the Russians and do some damage. Enough to win the war? No. Enough to be more than an irritant? Sometimes. But right now, it looks like the Russians have pretty good defenses all up and down the front. And they're moving forward as a consequence. The problem for the Russians, as you point out, is behind the front. It's Russia itself. That's 1,100 mile front that you're trying to defend. And they have a lot more in terms of air and missile defense than we do. But it's still very difficult to do that. And that's why a lot of these things get through.
Now, there's an additional development here. This is according to the Ukraine press, the Kiev Post, is it's not just that Ukraine now no longer has defensive missiles to knock anything down from ballistic missiles and hypersonics from Russia, but now Russia is apparently increasing its offensive capacity at the same time. So Russia could soon launch 200 ballistic missiles in a single attack instead of the 70 or so that they've been doing here of late, because their capacity is growing. It's not even that it's more, but it's continuing to escalate. What does that tell you about the course of this war? Maybe what it might look like in Ukraine over the rest of this year?
The Russians could actually concentrate more firepower than that. The reason they haven't is that they are holding much in reserve, because there is still this belief in Russia, even in Moscow, that conceivably Europeans could try to intervene in Western Ukraine. That you could see NATO forces from the Baltic states or Poland or Slovakia or Romania, more likely, move into Western Ukraine. So they're holding a lot of troops in reserve. They've increased the size of their forces dramatically. They're over 1 million. And they've got the equipment, and a lot of people are training right now that as a result of a recent call-up. They can concentrate more, but they're still holding this in reserve. And again, this all goes back to Donald Trump. If Donald Trump, as the leader of NATO, believed in anything he said, this war would have ended a long time ago. But it turns out he doesn't. He's turned out to be the toothless monster, if you will. Instead of being the great gargantuan beast that everyone Europe thought he was. He's some version of the Cookie Monster. Nothing's changed. He's not really in charge because the same people that were there under Biden and who were there before Biden, in fact, under Obama, not as many, but almost, and going back to the Bush administration, the same kinds of people have risen to the top and are controlling things now. And they want the war with Russia to continue, and they want the war against Iran and anybody else in the Middle East that opposes Israeli expansion to continue. So that's the tragedy.
Dan, you got to bring yourself in, Dan.
Did not realize I was out. I want to spend the last few minutes we have here on something the kind of domestic. I know that's something you pay a lot of attention to, and that is the education of our armed forces. This piece in the American Conservative by Kelly Vlahos, a mutual friend of ours. Do Hegseth's reforms to military universities go far enough? Hegseth came in and he was apparently, really excited about going after wokeness and a bunch of stuff like that. But is it far enough? And is that even the right thing to focus on? What do you think?
Well, it's something that deserves a focus, but there has to be a larger strategic framework. And that doesn't exist right now. It's kind of interesting. I thought it was wonderful that she used the expression of military universities, because I and many of my peers who are familiar with the United States Military Academy at West Point have long since stopped calling it a military academy. It isn't. It's a university where boys and girls wear uniforms and go to classes together. That's about it. The original mission of the military academy was to provide officers for the regular army. The new mission statement talks about leaders for America and all this kind of nonsense. I think all of the military academies have become these kinds of universities. And the question is, do we need them? I'm not interested in funding people's 4-year educations at quote unquote military universities. I want to get back to what are we trying to get out of it? What's the goal? What are we extracting? So that's part of it. The other part is at higher levels. What are we doing to impart really useful knowledge, science, technology, military operations, operational art, all of these things? Well, the problem is we don't hold anyone accountable, Dan. If you show up, you graduate. Now, there are always some people that don't, 1 or 2 individuals, usually for reasons that don't have much to do with performance. Sometimes they do, but let us say out of 285 that matriculate at the National Defense University, 285 routinely graduate. Who are we kidding? Is this really a course of instruction? Is something really being learned? The other thing is we have a lot of single service war colleges. Well, I don't think single service warfare is viable anymore. And I think the biggest problem we have is that there's not enough emphasis and understanding of what real integrative operations need to look like in the future. We're still living in the 1947 National Security Act that enshrined really the way the services fought World War II, or at least how they thought it was fought. That's why Eisenhower opposed it. There were a lot of people that didn't like it because it made matters worse. It didn't improve the situation. The bureaucracies at the service level took over, and the rest is history. Congress doesn't care. All they're interested in is where does the money go, and do I benefit from it? Do my constituents, do my donors? So they don't give a damn. I listened to a senator just excoriate Pete Hegseth. You can say what you want about Pete Hegseth. Anybody who's Secretary of Defense is going to be under fire from time to time. He's obviously said some things that are probably unfortunate, but that he's not responsible for everything you're seeing right now. He didn't walk into that institution and somebody didn't walk up and hand him, sir, here's your guidebook. And you need to look at the levels of readiness in the armed forces, in all of the services. You need to look at the combat forces, the mission-focused capability packages. You need to look at the various modernization programs, and you need to look at what we have in our arsenal, what we have sitting on the ground, Air Force, Navy, Army, Marines, and understand what we're really postured to do, what kind of war we can or cannot fight, and the impact of the last 30 years. Okay. Nobody did that. Nobody did it. Nobody does that. And in most cases, what does the Secretary of Defense do? What does the Secretary of Service do? He shows up, Dan, and he presides. They give him a funny little hat that says SecNav and put little stars on it, or a funny little hat that says boss and SecDef or some other crap. So no one has been asked to look at anything. All there is a budget with money. And then he comes across and says, well, the wars cost a lot of money. Well, it's your fault because you lost the war. Okay. Well, he has had a role in it. Nobody's going to refute that. But who are you kidding, Senator? What have you done? Have you led any charges lately against illegal wars? Have you raised any constitutional questions?
Great point.
What do you know about the armed forces? What do you know about who commands it, how they get there? You don't know. You don't know anything about these so-called universities and how useless they are. Who the hell are we kidding? This is not professional. I can take you to some surprising places. I could take you to Poland and show you a real General Staff Academy. And I could show you real General Staff students. And you would understand that 10% of the students are probably going to fail. They won't pass the course and become General Staff officers. They will be returned to duty without prejudice. You're not a General Staff officer. You're a very good line officer, and you're still in line for future promotion. But you're not a General Staff officer. You don't get that designation. So after 2 years, we're sorry, farewell, goodbye, good luck. We don't have a system like that. And the reason we don't have it is because the people in it don't want it. I sat next to people at the Leavenworth Staff College, and they were nice people, but I would say at least half of the group that I was with had no business being there. These people were struggling with how to write an operations order. Are you kidding? That's insane. And they said, well, you know all about this stuff. You need to come and help us. And, the staff group leaders said, you need to get in there and help. What is this? Special Olympics in the military? This is outrageous. This is nonsense. But this has been going on for years. And a lot of these guys go on to be generals. Because how do you get there? Well, you get there by never rocking the boat. We know that. And so when it comes to picking people, what do you pick? You pick people not on the basis of what they've done that's especially impressive or outstanding. You pick them on the basis of what they haven't done. Haven't you ever heard the expression, I know I've heard this in many services, well, he's commanded successfully at every level. And we all sat there and laughed. And what, peacetime? Right. Who the hell are we kidding? It's a joke. All of this has got to be addressed. This administration can't do it. And
Mr. Doug, I'll ask the obvious question. Who's qualified to ask those questions or to, other than you? And obviously you've already written a whole slew of books on this stuff, and anyone who wants to can read it. That's the outlet. Pick you. Is there a better question? Is there anybody that has the ability or the knowledge to even address the questions?
Yes, there are, both civilian and military. There definitely are. But you have to set out to identify those people. Then you bring them together. You protect them from all the slings and arrows that will be hurled at them from the outside. You sequester them and give them the time and the support to put together the alternatives. In other words, to find the right solutions, to set up ultimately a new structure and a new system. That's what the British did in 1905 until about 1912 under a new Secretary of War after the Boer War. Because even though they won the Boer War, they had to commit 250,000 British troops to take on and fight at any one time no more than about 35,000 Boers. And they performed badly. All right. They won because they had the resources, they had the numbers, and they were ultimately able to open concentration camps and put Boer women and children and old men in them, where 70,000+ of them died of starvation and disease. That's how they won the Boer War. Now, my point is, He knew that. A man, his name was Richard Haldane, very brilliant man, and a lawyer, by the way, with no military experience. But he knew this had to change. And there were a number of people in uniform that also recognized it. And so they did a pretty good job. And that army that came out of that ends up fighting very well in 1914. The problem was it was an army designed for everything but war on the European continent against the Germans. So they all died, but they fought well. And then they were replaced by, millions of citizen soldiers who did the best they could, but they ended up like our citizen soldiers during World War I, but more important, during the Civil War. So, Grant was asked by, and I'll shut up after this. Grant was asked by a journalist what unit was he most proud of having served with in his career. This is long after he'd retired. And he answered Zachary Taylor's army in the Mexican War. And this man was shocked. And he went on to talk about the fact, well, Zachary Taylor's army was a professional force. Most of the soldiers we had were professionals. We were augmented, but the core army was a professional force, and they were brilliant. We could outperform, we could outmaneuver the Mexicans, even though they always outnumbered us 3 or 4 to 1. And then he said, well, you have to understand, well, what about the Civil War? He said, we have to understand those were citizen soldiers. They were brave and courageous and good men, but it's not the same as a professional force. And what happened during the Civil War? How many men did we lose in frontal attacks in the last year plus of the war in order to bring the war to a close? And people used to call Grant the Butcher. And of course, what he knew is that what else can we do? I only have so many trained professionals. I can only do so much. Now, my point is, we don't want that for the future, but we need to think very carefully about what that future should look like. I think what Secretary Hegseth has suggested, there's nothing wrong with it. The problem is, how do you go about it? And remember, none of these institutions, nor the people in charge of them, can reform themselves.
All right. That's a fact. And I don't know how we're going to get somebody in there that's qualified. I'm glad to know there are other folks, but we're going to have to do something to start getting them elevated. And that requires somebody at the top willing to do it. And so far, we don't have that. So we're just going to have to hope that shows up.
Not just the guy at the top.